Hello everyone. Removal of dental caries and preparing the tooth ready to receive the restorative material is one of the most important steps which is employed in operative dentistry. It is essential to understand the fundamentals which are involved in tooth preparation in detail. If you are a dental student watching this presentation, consider subscribing to my YouTube channel Smart Dentistry Student Zone. I will make videos that will be really helpful for dental students. Tooth preparation is defined as the mechanical alteration of a defective, injured or diseased tooth in order to best receive a restorative material which will re-establish a healthy state for the tooth, including aesthetic corrections along with normal form and function. For easy understanding, the tooth preparation is divided into different stages and steps. Tooth preparation can be broadly divided into two stages: the initial stage and the final stage. In the initial stage, there are four steps which are outline form and initial depth, primary resistance form, primary retention form and convenience form. In the final stage, there are 5 steps which are removal of any remaining infected dentine or old restorative material, pulp protection if indicated, secondary resistance and retention forms, procedures for finishing external walls, final procedures like cleaning, inspecting and desensitizing the tooth preparation. In this presentation, we will see in detail about the initial stage of tooth preparation. The first step in the initial stage of tooth preparation is outline form and initial depth. There are two important features which have to be considered while understanding outline form and initial depth. Placing the cavity margins in a position they will occupy the final restoration except for finishing enamel, walls and margin. That is, we should extend the tooth preparation and place the margins of the restoration in a position which will be occupied by the final restoration. So this is the first feature. And the second feature is preparing an initial depth of around 0.2 to 0.8 millimeters below dentino-enamel junction. Whether the tooth preparation or the extent of the decay is bigger and deeper than the specified depth, but in the initial stage, we should never make the tooth preparation deeper than this specified depth of 0.2 to 0.8 millimeters. The outline form and initial depth are governed by different principles, factors and features. Let's see about all these in detail. The first principle is about the removal of unsupported enamel. In this picture, we can see there is a tooth which has a deep dental caries. Just imagine that we have prepared the tooth, removing all the dental decay in such a fashion. But we can see that the enamel which is present is not well supported by the underlying dentine. This unsupported enamel will be weak. Even after doing a restoration, this area remains as a weak surface and which will lead to formation of cracks and ditching of the margins. So finally, this unsupported enamel will break definitely, leaving the margin of the restoration open. So the first principle in outline form and initial depth mandates the removal of unsupported enamel completely. The second principle which is involved in the outline form and initial depth is the caries have to be removed completely. Especially the caries which is present in the walls and the margins must be removed completely. But if some caries needs to be left, or if you are expecting that the excavation of the caries might result in the pulp exposure, then it can be left under certain circumstances closer to the pulp. But the caries should be never ever left without removal from the margins and also from the walls. The third principle states that all the margins should be placed in a position to allow finishing of the margins of the restoration. You have to understand that margins of the restorations are the areas which are more prone for occurrence of secondary caries. If a restoration have to fail, it will start breaking or ditching or failing from the margins. So whenever we are doing a restoration, care should be given to finish and polish the margins of the restoration and also keep the margins of the restoration in a location which is accessible, so that while the patient is brushing and also by the physiological movement of the saliva, physiological movement of the food while chewing can clean the margins and keep the restoration surface plaque free. We will see more about this margins of the restoration and keeping it away from the contact area while studying about the convenience form. Next, let's see about the factors which are involved in determining the outline form and initial depth. The first factor is the extent of the carious lesion, defect or faulty old restoration. So it explains that if the carious lesion is small, the tooth preparation that you are going to prepare will also be small. If the carious extension is wide, and your tooth preparation will also be wide. So not only the decay, if there is an old restorative material which is large, and if you are going to replace, your tooth preparation and your outline form will be obviously large. The second factor which determines the outline form is the aesthetic consideration. In the picture, you can see that there is a mesial caries in tooth number 11 and 21. We should understand that there is no restorative material which can mimic exactly like that of the natural tooth structure. So whenever it is possible, the labial enamel should be preserved. So in this case, the labial enamel can be preserved by excavating the caries from a palatal aspect. Thus, the labial enamel can be preserved so that the aesthetics can be maintained and a better aesthetic restoration can be given to the patient. The next factor is the preservation of healthy and vital tooth structure. There are no restorative material which mimics or which is better than the natural tooth structure. So under whatever the cost, we should always preserve the healthy and the vital tooth structure. The tooth structure should never be removed unnecessarily. The outline form and initial depth is also governed by the type of the restorative material used. In the first picture, you can see that there is a decay. In the second, third and the fourth pictures, you can see the cavity outline for cast metal restoration, composite and an amalgam restoration. The caries is just the same, but the tooth preparation for all the three types of restorations are different. This is because each restorative material requires the tooth preparation of different shape and configuration. So the next factor is the occlusal considerations. Always keep in mind, whenever there is occlusion, the opposing cusp of a tooth should never come and rest in the margins of the restorations. So the margins of the restorations are the weak surface in a restoration, and if an opposing cusp is occluding in the margin of the restoration, the margin will start breaking down. So that have to be decided, and the cavity outline, if needed, have to be modified. Sometimes the outline form is also determined by the adjacent tooth contour. There may be a rotated tooth, there may be a tooth which is missing, there may be a adjacent tooth which may be submerged. In all those situations, the cavity outline have to be modified in order to suit and create a better contact with the adjacent tooth. The last factor which governs the outline form and initial depth is the Cavo-surface configuration. The angle or the margin which is formed between the prepared and the unprepared tooth surface is called as the Cavo-surface margin. The Cavo-surface configuration can be different depending upon the type of the restorative material. For a cast metal restoration, we have to place a bevel in the Cavo-surface margin, but for an amalgam restoration, the margin should have a butt joint or a 90-degree joint. So this also have to be decided and taken into consideration while preparing the outline form and the initial depth. So these are the 7 factors which governs the outline form and initial depth. Next, let's see about the features which govern the outline form and initial depth. The first feature is preserving the cuspal strength. This is a very important topic, and this is a very important concept, and I expect everyone to understand this very clearly. In the picture, you can see there is a central groove and a cusp tip. So we have to measure the distance from the central groove to the cusp tip, because the cuspal strength and the protection or the preservation of the cuspal strength depends upon the distance or the extent of the tooth preparation from the central groove towards the cusp tip. At this stage, we have to understand something called as cusp capping. What is this cusp capping? Whenever there is a caries or a tooth preparation which is getting extended towards the cusp tip, the cusp will become weak. Once if the cusp is weak, under masticatory load, the cusp will fracture. In order to prevent the cusp fracture, we have to reduce 1.5 to 2 mm of the cusp, and it is included along with the restoration. So this procedure is called as cusp capping. So in cusp capping, we reduce 1.5 to 2 mm of the cusp, and it is included along with the restoration as shown in this picture. So this is called as cusp capping. Now we have to understand when we are supposed to do cusp capping and when cusp capping is not indicated. So in this picture, we can see that there is a cavity extension which is less than half the distance from the central fissure towards the cusp tip. So in this situation, there is no need for cusp capping. So in the second example, there is a tooth preparation or there is a caries extension which is extending 1/2 to 2/3 of the distance from the central fissure to cusp tip. So in those situations, we have to consider cusp capping. So if the cusp remains very strong, then there is no need for cusp capping. And in the third example, we can see that there is a caries which is extending more than 2/3 the distance from the central fissure or the central groove to the cusp tip. In this situation, the cusp is definitely weak and cusp capping is mandatory. The second feature which governs the outline form and initial depth is preserving the marginal ridge strength. Marginal ridges are very essential for reinforcement of the tooth and to prevent fracture of the tooth. If the marginal ridges are weak, then there are chances that the tooth may get cracked or the restoration may fail. Again, this is a very important question which is asked during Viva. What should be the width or the thickness of the marginal ridge after tooth preparation? For a molar, the thickness of the marginal ridge should be 2 mm after tooth preparation, and for a premolar, it should be 1.6 mm. If this thickness is maintained, then the tooth will be strong and it can resist fracture. The next feature is minimizing the facio-lingual extension. In the example, you can see that there is a decay and two types of tooth preparation has been done. The first preparation is a very narrow one and the second preparation is a wide one. So whenever it is possible, we should prepare the cavity which is narrowest as possible. Unnecessarily, if we are making the cavity wide or extending the preparation wider facio-lingually, then the tooth will become weak and weaker. So the cavity preparation should be kept as narrow as possible. In the picture which is given, you can see that there is a mesial and a distal tooth preparation in the maxillary molar. So this feature of the outline form and initial depth states that whenever there are two defects or two tooth preparations which are getting closer, less than 0.5 mm, then it have to be removed and it should be included as a wider or a single cavity preparation. So if the distance between two preparation or defect is less than 0.5 millimeter, that tooth have to be removed because it will be weak and it can lead to cracks and fractures. The fifth feature of the outline form and initial depth states that enameloplasty have to be considered whenever it is feasible. So enameloplasty is a procedure in which the deep pits and fissures are opened up and it is shallowed so that it can be cleansed and the food will not stay inside those deep pits and fissures. So this procedure is also called as saucerization or fissurotomy. So basically the deep pits and fissures we are opening up and we are making it shallow so that it can be cleansed by the patient and the chances for the occurrence of dental caries will be less. The last feature in the outline form and initial depth states that restricting the depth of the preparation inside dentin. For a pit and fissure caries, the depth should be restricted to 0.2 mm inside dentino-enamel junction, and for a smooth surface caries, the depth should be restricted 0.8 mm inside dentino-enamel junction. So for a pit and fissure caries, the depth of the tooth preparation which is kept initially should be 0.2 mm inside dentino-enamel junction, and for smooth surface caries it is 0.8 mm inside dentino-enamel junction. So these are the principal features and factors have to be considered while doing tooth preparation and establishing the outline form and initial depth. Now let's move on to the primary resistance form, which is the second step in tooth preparation. Let's start with a small example. In this picture, you can see that there is a dental caries. We have prepared the tooth and restored it with a restorative material. In the first picture, we have prepared the tooth into a big cavity and it is restored with a restorative material. In the second preparation, we have made a very small preparation and restored with a restorative material. Which one will be stronger? In the first preparation, the restoration will be strong because it is a wide and it is a large restoration, so with bulk of the restorative material. So the restoration will be stronger, but the tooth is weakened, so the tooth will break. But in the second situation, the tooth is strong, but the restorative material is thin, so the restorative material will break. So while doing a tooth preparation, we should maintain an optimum depth and we should maintain both the strength of the restorative material and also the tooth. So the primary resistance form states that the shape and placement of the preparation walls that best enable the remaining tooth structure and the restoration to withstand without fracture under masticatory forces delivered principally in the long axis of the tooth. Like the outline form and initial depth, there are certain principles and features which have to be taken into consideration while providing the primary resistance form. The first principle and feature is the relatively horizontal floors. Whenever we are doing a preparation, the floor of the tooth preparation should be flat and horizontal. It should not be slanting in one of the direction. If it is horizontal and flat, the restorative material can rest in the pulpal floor, and whenever the force which is transmitted while doing mastication will be distributed uniformly towards the rest of the tooth structure. So whenever we are doing a tooth preparation, in order to provide a good primary resistance form, the floor should have a flat and a horizontal appearance. The second principle and feature is the box-like shape. A box-like or a mortise type of cavity preparation is needed in order to provide a good resistance form. A box type of tooth preparation will keep the restorative material stable without undue movements, and it will also reinforce the restorative material and also the tooth. So whenever you are doing a preparation, the tooth preparation should have a box-like cavity shape. The third principle states that all the weakened tooth structure should be included along with the tooth preparation. If there is a little tooth structure which is weak, which is left without removal, which can lead to fracture and which can compromise the success of the restorative treatment. The next feature is the preservation of cuspal and marginal ridges. Like we mentioned already in the outline form and initial depth, the preservation of cusp and the marginal ridges should be taken into consideration. The walls of the preparation or the cavity width should be kept as small as possible. So, a optimal width of the tooth preparation have to be maintained so that the restoration will also be stronger. At the same time, the tooth will also be strong. The next important feature in providing a primary resistance form is the rounded internal line angles. If the internal line angles are sharp, it can act as a point of stress concentration and it can transmit the occlusal or the masticatory forces towards the different areas of the tooth, which can act as a stress concentration point and lead to fracture of the tooth. In order to avoid that, the internal line angles of the tooth preparation should be rounded. But keep it in mind, for direct filling gold restorations, we will prepare the tooth with a sharp internal line angles. The next feature is providing adequate thickness of the restorative material. Each restorative material have their own properties. Some are strong in compression, some are weak in compression. So in order to get the optimum result and to provide the best and the strongest restoration possible, the adequate thickness of every specific restorative material should be maintained. For dental amalgam, 1.5 to 2 mm of thickness of the restorative material should be provided. For a cast metal restoration, 1 to 2 mm, and for porcelain or the ceramic restoration, 2 mm of minimum thickness of the restorative material should be provided. For a composite restoration, 1 to 2 mm of the restorative material will be adequate to provide strong restoration. The last feature in the primary resistance form is the reduction of cusp for capping when indicated. As we have seen in the outline form and initial depth, the cuspal strength have to be preserved, and whenever the cusp has become weak, it have to be reduced and it should be included along with the restoration in the name of cusp capping. So whenever the cavity extends from the central fissure towards the cusp tip more than 2/3, then cusp capping is mandatory. So these are the different principles, features and factors which are essential to maintain and to provide an adequate primary resistance form while doing the tooth preparation. That concludes the primary resistance form. And now let's see about the primary retention form. Primary retention form is defined as that shape or form of the conventional tooth preparation that resists displacement or removal of the restoration from tipping or lifting forces. This can be better understood with this example. There are two types of tooth preparations made in the above tooth. Both the preparations we made it with a different configuration and we restored it with some restorative material. Let's assume that the patient is eating some sticky foods and the food gets stuck with the restorative material and it is pulled out of the cavity. Let's think whether the first restoration will come out of the cavity preparation or the second restoration will come out of the cavity preparation. Obviously, the second restoration will get dislodged but not the first one. Why? Because in the first tooth preparation, the occlusal area, which is mentioned as number 2, is narrower, while the area which is closer to the pulpal floor, which is mentioned as number 1, is wider. So the restoration gets stuck inside the tooth, and even if you are pulling it out, it will not get dislodged. This type of retention is called as mechanical retention. So whenever we are preparing a tooth for a restorative material where mechanical retention needs to be provided, we will prepare the occlusal surface of the cavity narrower compared to that of the pulpal surface. So what happens is the restoration will get locked within the tooth preparation. This type of tooth preparation is made for dental amalgam. Now let's see a tooth with a decay. Let's magnify and we shall see the decay. Let's remove that decayed part of the tooth preparation, and if you are restoring with a restorative material, it will get dislodged. Why? Because it don't have any type of retention, because the occlusal surface is wider. So the restoration will break off and it will come out of the cavity. So we should provide some other form of retention so that the restoration will never get dislodged. So in order to provide that, we place acid etchant, which is 37% phosphoric acid, on the surface of the tooth preparation. Once it is placed, the phosphoric acid will start removing the mineral content from the surface of the tooth. Once the acid etchant is rinsed off, the acid would have created micro irregularities in the surface of the tooth. Now if you are applying a liquid resin in the name of a bonding agent in that micro irregularities which are created by the acid etchant, this resin will penetrate inside all those micro irregularities and it will get stuck there. And on top of that, if you are placing a resin based material, it will bond or it will get joined to that of the bonding agent which we have applied. Now if we are trying to dislodge this restoration, it will not. This will get bonded tightly to that of the tooth, and this type of retention is called as micromechanical retention. So in micromechanical retention, we are creating micro irregularities on the surface of the tooth by application of the acid etchants, and it is rinsed off. Then a liquid resin called as the bonding agent is applied and it is light cured. On top of that, we apply a resin based composite material and which will bond to that bonding agent we have applied. Let's move on to the other situations. Here, a tooth is prepared and it is restored with a restorative material. Certain chemicals which are present within the restorative material will start leaching and it will bond or it will get adhere to that of the tooth structure. This is called as a chemical mode of retention. For example, glass ionomer cement gets bonded to the tooth by chemical mode of retention. So there are three types of retentions. One is the mechanical retention, which is provided for dental amalgam, micromechanical retention, which is provided for composite restorations, and the chemical retention, which is provided by a glass ionomer cement restoration. So that's about the primary retention form. Now let's see about the convenience form, which is the fourth step in the initial stage of tooth preparation. Occasionally, the tooth preparation and the restorative procedure needs to be done so that it will be convenient for the tooth preparation, removal of the decay, and also for the restorative purpose. So this is called as the convenience form. So by definition, convenience form is that the shape or form of the preparation that provides for adequate observation, accessibility, and ease of operation in preparing and restoring the tooth. So there are 3 points which have to be taken into consideration. 1, it should provide adequate observation, accessibility, and the ease of operation by the operator. Let's see about the different principal features and factors which have to be taken into consideration while doing tooth preparation. At first, adequate access should be provided to remove caries from deeper areas. In the example, there is a deep dental caries, and by preparing a narrow cavity, we attempted to remove the dental caries. But we won't be able to remove the deeper caries without extending the cavity wider. So, just for the sake of removing the deeper caries, the entire cavity is widened. So occasionally this is mandatory and this is necessary to remove the deeper caries, we may have to widen the cavity preparation. So this is a convenience form because we are extending the cavity wider just for the removal of caries from the deeper areas. The next feature to be taken into consideration is the adequate accessibility to instruments. Let's consider that there is a narrow caries and we have made a narrow cavity preparation. We have put the restorative material inside the cavity preparation and we are trying to compact it. But our instruments which are used for compaction are bigger in size than the width of the cavity which we have prepared. So we will not be able to compact the restorative material. So sometimes the cavity needs to be made wider so that instruments will have accessibilities inside the tooth preparation. So that is also a convenience feature. Next, the clearance with the adjacent proximal surface. Whenever we are preparing the tooth that we have prepared should be cleared from the adjacent tooth by around 0.5 millimeters facially and lingually and around 0.2 millimeters gingivally from the adjacent tooth. This is provided so that the margins of the restorations can be kept in self-cleansing areas. Self-cleansing areas are those areas which can be cleaned by the patient and also that will get cleaned by the physiological movement of the saliva and the food materials while chewing. If the margin of the restoration is kept inside the contact area, then it will act as a nidus where there can be food accumulation and plaque formation which can lead to development of secondary caries. So for no restorative material, ideally the margin of the restoration should never be kept inside the contact area. So it should be always kept in an area which is self-cleansable. The occlusal divergence which is provided in the tooth preparation for a cast metal restoration is a convenience feature. For a cast metal restoration, we have to prepare a cavity, then a wax pattern is made. This wax pattern is casted and the metal cast restoration is luted within the cavity. If there is an occlusal convergence, this metal casting will never go inside the prepared cavity. So in order to make the restorative procedure accessible and possible, we have to provide an occlusal divergence. So providing a occlusal divergence in a cast metal restoration is a convenience feature. For a gold foil restoration, the convenience points are provided in the line and the point angles of the tooth preparation. Some sharp point angles are created in the tooth preparation which will act as a convenience point from where the restorative procedure of the direct filling gold restoration is initiated. So providing a convenience point is also a convenience feature. Removal of marginal ridge or tooth structure in case of proximal caries excavation. In this picture we can see that there is a deep caries which is present below the marginal ridge, but the marginal ridge is intact, but there is no way that this caries can be removed without removing the marginal ridge. So in those situations, the marginal ridge may have to be removed just for the purpose of removing the caries which is present underneath the marginal ridge. So the marginal ridge is sacrificed for removal of the deep caries below the marginal ridge, and this is also a convenience feature. And the last factor which have to be taken into consideration is whenever we are planning to do cusp capping, we have to reduce the cusp and include along with the preparation early in the preparation. So it can be considered as a first step while preparing the tooth so that the cusp can be reduced and which can be included into the tooth preparation. So what will be the advantages? So the remaining areas of the tooth can be prepared in a well conservative manner. Why? Because once the cusp is reduced, we will get a good accessibility. So once a good accessibility is attained, the remaining areas of the tooth can be prepared more conservatively. So, reduction of the cusp, whenever if it is indicated, should be done early in the tooth preparation. So this is all about the convenience form, and we have finished the initial stage of tooth preparation. I hope this presentation is helpful for all the dental students, and in the next presentation I will explain about the final stage of tooth preparation. Stay tuned. Thank you and have a nice day.